The senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, I rise today to ask my colleagues to support H.J. Res. 37, a resolution disapproving of the federal acquisition regulation issued by the Department of Defense, the General Services Administration, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Now, Mr. President, as is the case in so many of these rules and regulations, it has a really nice name. It sounds really good, the Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces rule. But the bottom line, because of the substance of this rule, has become commonly known as the Blacklisting Rule. Now, had it been up to me, I would have called it the Blackmailing Rule, and let me explain why. It requires contractors and subcontractors submitting bids on federal government contracts to disclose any proven or alleged violations within the last 3 years of 14 different labor laws plus, and I quote, equivalent state laws, unquote. Now, that may sound reasonable, but it is not, and it is entirely unnecessary. Any competent purchasing manager, and again, I come from the private sector, there are a lot of competent purchasing managers, could readily obtain the information required by this regulation. And of course, any competent purchasing manager should also always be evaluating the qualifications, integrity, and the past performance record of any kind of potential supplier. This rule also has the very real potential of subjecting perfectly innocent contractors to blackmail and extortion tactics during union contract negotiations. Now, in case anyone thinks I'm overstating this threat, listen carefully to the following quote from one union describing an, quote, ideal message their union president should convey to a general manager of a business negotiating a union contract. And I quote, putting it plainly, unless you settle this strike within the next few days and the union withdraws its charges, those would be those allegations, unless the union withdraws those charges, you are likely to be marked as a repeat labor law offender, one of the highest categories of wrongdoing under the President's order. Check this out with your hotshot legal team. Counting all of its divisions, this union message goes on, this corporation has federal contracts in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you really want to jeopardize this pot of gold to save a few $100,000 to the union contract? Unquote. This is the kind of negotiating tactic that illustrates exactly how this regulation would be used as a form of federally sanctioned blackmail. There would be no due process for contractors wrongly accused. There would be no way for them to defend themselves or avoid being blacklisted. As if the blackmail potential of the rule isn't bad enough, the Obama administration admitted that the final rule would cost at least $398 million to comply with every single year. And except for the benefit that extortion leverage provides to unions, I can think of no financial benefit to taxpayers or our economy. And neither could the Obama administration, as they were unable to quantify any financial benefit for this rule in their regulatory filings. Now, in addition to the $398 million annual regulatory cost, the agencies themselves detailed the following regulatory burdens. The rule will affect over 24,000 contractors. Industry estimates are even higher. The rule imposes costly reporting requirements on small businesses that many simply cannot bear. And it also reduces the availability and increases the price of much-needed supplies and services, including to our military. Others have pointed out even more problems with the rule. For example, it does not define what the equivalent state laws are that have been included in the disclosure requirement. Also, the definition of a violation that is reportable is incredibly broad. It is not limited to government contracts and includes pending and other non-final disputes. In other words, mere allegations of wrongdoing. In particular, this is a slippery slope. For example, in fiscal year 2016, the National Labor Relations Board received over 21,000 unfair labor practice charges, but more than half of those were withdrawn or dismissed, and less than 6% resulted in a formal complaint by the NLRB. Also in fiscal year 2016, The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission received over 91,000 complaints, but issued a determination of reasonable cause in only 3,113, about 3.4% of those, and filed enforcement suits in only 114, about 0.1% of that 91,000 complaints that were filed. Various studies report that it costs $2 trillion per year to comply with federal government regulations. That's $14,800 per family per year. Of course, Mr. President, no one writes a check for $14,800. Instead, those costs are realized in reduced opportunities, higher prices to consumers, and stagnated wages and benefits for hardworking Americans. Economic growth is the primary component of a solution for many of our country's problems. Yet Washington continues to stifle growth by adding layer upon layer of regulation. The Blacklisting Rule is just one harmful example. Fortunately, last October, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas issued a nationwide preliminary injunction the day before this rule was set to go into effect. The judge issuing the order noted there was merit to the claims that this rule violates statute, exceeds executive authority, and is unconstitutional. The court found that letting this rule go into effect would cause, quote, irreparable harm. But the case is still pending. Until we act to decisively repeal this rule, a significant burden hangs over our country's contractors and suppliers. Through the use of the Congressional Review Act, we have the opportunity to reduce that regulatory burden and repair a small portion of the damage done by President Obama's regulatory overreach. Mr. President, we owe it to the American people and American businesses to start providing them with regulatory relief. I urge my colleagues to vote yes to disapprove and repeal this very harmful, very costly, and completely unnecessary rule. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.